Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. I was stationed in Ottawa when it started, the real start, not the warning signs that everyone ignored in other cities. My name is Chloe Dumais, Staff Sergeant, RCMP, Mounted Patrol. I've been with the force for 17 years. Before this, I spent most of my days keeping tourists from leaning over the railings at the Centennial Flame and posing for pictures next to my horse. Orage, that was his name, meant storm, fitting now I suppose. We kept order in parks, downtown squares, protest zones. But that weekend, everything changed. A call came through from Central Division. Rideau Center reported a group fight on the second floor. At first they said it was just rowdy teens. Then a second report said there was blood, screaming, a woman bitten on the neck by a man who wouldn't let go. By the time we were dispatched, the mall was locked down. My unit was 4 strong. Myself, Constable Dwyer, Constable Hood, and Constable Levine. All of us mounted, all of us geared for public crowd control. Hard helmets, stab vests, batons, sidearms, radios. We had 2 female horses and 2 geldings. I rode Orage. He was skittish in storms but calm in crowds, more reliable than most of the people I worked with. We arrived just before noon. The perimeter around the Rideau Center was cordoned off with makeshift tape and 2 city cruisers, but there were no ambulances, no hazmat, no tactical teams, just some junior officers standing around like they didn't know who was in charge. That should have been the first clue. Nobody was in charge anymore. Someone higher up gave an order for our unit to maintain visibility along Wellington Street. Parliament Hill was filling with people, tourists mostly. News was already leaking out. Something had happened in Toronto, and Montreal was seeing unrest. The public was starting to get nervous, so our job was to calm the optics. Mounted patrol gives a sense of control, height, authority. That's what the brass wanted. Presence. I remember looking toward the hill and seeing families still taking photos. A couple from Europe was holding a Canadian flag between them, smiling in front of the East Block like it was just another summer morning. They had no idea that the world was already breaking apart just 2 blocks away. Then came the broadcast. Not on our radios, on everyone's phones. The national alert system kicked in, that harsh, shrieking tone that cuts through everything. The message was short, robotic. Emergency alert. Shelter in place. Do not approach individuals exhibiting aggressive or erratic behavior. Ottawa region under lockdown. Further instructions to follow. That's when the crowd stopped smiling. Within 5 minutes, the lawn in front of Parliament went from tourist stop to mass exodus. People rushed toward their cars, toward the canal, toward nowhere really. We were ordered to stay in position and direct traffic away from the gates. The center block was sealed. Barricades started going up. By the time the military arrived, it was too late. The first infected had already reached Spark Street. They didn't look like movie monsters. No exposed bones, no roaring. Just pale, shuffling people with torn clothes, sunken eyes, and blood drying on their mouths. We didn't know what we were looking at. Not yet. One of them, a man with a broken leg that dragged behind him like it wasn't even there, reached the first layer of panicked pedestrians and lunged. No warning, no growl, just sank his teeth into the side of a teenager's neck like it was normal. Gunfire started near Bank Street. Not from police, civilians. Someone pulled a handgun and fired into the crowd. Didn't matter if he hit the infected or not. The panic was already in full motion. Dwyer shouted at me that we needed to fall back toward the Chateau Laurier. We could funnel civilians east across the bridge. Keep them out of the downtown core. I agreed. But the bridge was already jammed. Hundreds of people on foot, vehicles abandoned. A city bus had crashed against the rail and was burning. Smoke drifted low over the Rideau Canal. Someone said the 417 was closed, all exits sealed. No one in or out. Command stopped responding on the radio after that. We tried channel 2, then 3. Nothing. The dispatch center had gone dark. I heard rumors later that someone inside got infected, locked the doors, and it spread from room to room like a fire. Orange was jumpy. His ears were flat, and he kept shifting under me. There was a smell, like copper and bile, that carried on the wind. We hadn't seen a zombie up close yet, but the sounds were getting closer. Screams that didn't taper off, bodies hitting pavement, windows breaking. Then came the worst part. Silence. The kind that settles over a city right before it falls apart. We regrouped behind the gates at Parliament. The guards let us in, barely. They were already arguing with a federal agent in plainclothes who said his clearance meant he was allowed inside. Nobody knew if anyone's clearance mattered anymore. The MPs manning the West Gate asked if we were part of the final escort. We weren't. They told us to stay mounted and wait for orders. That's when I saw the trucks roll up, military transport, loaded with federal staffers, civil servants, some cabinet aides, maybe a couple of politicians. They were getting inside the hill compound. Not the hospitals, not the schools, just them. The gates closed behind the convoy, and we were told bluntly, "Hold the exterior, Parliament is sealed." So we stayed outside, the last patrol. It was late afternoon when we saw the first real swarm. Dozens of infected turning the corner near Elgin and heading toward us in a slow, crooked line. They moved like they couldn't feel their bones anymore, limbs bent in wrong directions. One had a chunk of windshield glass embedded in his chest. Another was barefoot, toenails torn to the quick, skin graying. We dismounted behind the barrier and formed a wedge line with our horses. Orridge bucked once but held position. Dwyer raised his baton, as if it would do anything. I drew my sidearm and aimed low. At the time, I still thought center mass would drop them. The first one reached us, a man in a torn suit, blood crusted in his beard. I shot twice. He didn't even slow down. Hurd had the presence of mind to yell "head" and fired once. The man collapsed like a puppet with the strings cut. That's when we understood. Headshots only. But there were more coming. 10, 15, maybe more behind them. They weren't fast, but they didn't stop, didn't feel pain. One took a ricochet to the jaw and still kept walking, jaw hanging by muscle and skin. A child was among them, maybe 6 years old, hair matted, clothes ripped. Her eyes were gone, just black pits. She stumbled forward with the others. Dwyer hesitated. I saw it in his face. And then she bit his horse. The mare screamed, bucked, and threw him. He hit the concrete hard and didn't get up. I opened fire, 3 rounds into the head. No one flinched. There was no room for hesitation anymore. Not in a world where that could happen. Levine grabbed Dwyer and dragged him back behind the barricade. His leg was twisted, possibly broken. His helmet was gone. I didn't let myself look at the body. Her blood was already on the concrete, and Dwyer's mare had bolted, trailing reins and panic in her wake. I could still hear the echo of hooves down Spark Street. There wasn't time to go after her. More infected were pushing through the side streets, stumbling over curbs, weaving between parked cars like wind-up toys slowly losing charge. The air stank of burnt oil, blood, and something sour underneath it all, like spoiled meat left too long in the sun. Every part of me knew it was going to get worse, fast. We hauled Dwyer behind an overturned barricade near the base of the flame. His leg was bad. I could see bone pressing up under the skin near his shin. He kept muttering that he was fine, but he couldn't stand, and his right boot had filled with blood. Levine tried to bind it with gauze from his saddlebag, hands shaking while infected screams echoed closer. There was no medevac coming, no rescue. Our radios were dead except for static and broken signals that cut out mid-word. We were no longer linked to anyone, just 3 RCMP officers in a dead zone, 1 down, 1 hurt, 1 trying to keep the last line from collapsing. I climbed back onto Orridge, the saddle slick from sweat and filth, and scanned the rooftops. Parliament's windows were dark. No movement. No signal from the guards. I spotted at least 10 more infected between the War Memorial and the locks. A few were dragging themselves, trailing ruined legs, while others limped or staggered upright, arms slack. It wasn't a horde, not yet, but there was no mistaking the direction they were heading. Toward us. Toward noise. Toward anything warm and breathing. Hurd returned, leading his horse and Dwyer's runaway mount. Both animals were trembling. He had blood on his uniform, not his own, and didn't speak until he dismounted. Said the Bywood market was gone. Fires burning. Bodies in the street. One of the side streets completely jammed with abandoned cars. No way out by road. He'd seen someone try to climb onto a stalled OC Transpo bus. Didn't make it. The infected swarmed him like they were drawn to motion, tearing him down in seconds. One of them had a chef's apron still on, soaked from neck to knees. They didn't look like monsters. They looked like people on the edge of collapse. We couldn't hold Parliament. That was clear. The brass had retreated behind locked doors and stopped answering. There was no forward line, no backup. The military convoys were already gone, probably rerouted to protect command assets and official evacuees. What remained in the downtown core were first responders, disconnected and dying by the minute, and the walking dead. Slow, brutal, and impossible to stop unless you knew where to shoot. I made the call to move, Supreme Court or nothing. It was elevated, with steps we could use as choke points. Enough visibility to see incoming threats. Maybe even a backup route through the west. I told Levine to help Dwyer mount double, even if it slowed us. We needed to get off Wellington before we were boxed in. The infected were already pushing up from O'Connor, their outlines smeared against the grey light like figures in a dream gone wrong. I led the column. Orridge's breath steamed in front of him, and I could feel his muscles tense with every step. He didn't want to move toward that smell. I couldn't blame him. We cut west, pushing through overturned bikes and knocked over planters. The quiet was broken only by the occasional gunshot in the distance and the distant low hum of something large flying overhead. I looked up once and saw the shadow of a twin rotor transport heading south, fast and low toward the river. Not ours. No markings. No radio ping. Whoever they weren't stopping. Probably extraction for someone who still had influence. Someone not on the street bleeding out with a busted leg and a jammed sidearm. The Supreme Court steps were empty for now. The doors were locked, but the main platform gave us a decent view of the approach roads. I ordered Hood to secure the eastern flank while I tried to reach anyone on my handset. Nothing but static. Levine found a working flashlight in one of the museum gift shop bags scattered across the plaza. That's when I realized how much had been abandoned. Backpacks, shopping bags, tourist maps. One of those novelty RCMP hats left trampled in a puddle of drying blood. It was like everyone had just vanished mid-step, or died trying to run. We used the first 10 minutes to patch Dwyer up and get water from a bottle that hadn't been smashed. Orridge and the others drank from a decorative fountain, their lips trembling, nostrils flaring. I kept watch. Every shadow looked wrong. Every alley became a trap in my mind. The infected weren't fast, but they moved with purpose. They never stopped, never hesitated, never cried out in pain. I watched one stagger across Kent Street on a shattered ankle like it didn't even register the bones weren't aligned. Its eyes were milky, its mouth hanging open like something had broken loose inside the brain. That's when the first group came into view. Survivors, not infected, 5 people running, 2 men, a woman, and 2 teens. They were screaming for help, waving their arms. I stood and raised mine, calling them forward. I told them to stay low, keep moving, follow our voices. They didn't listen. One of the teens, maybe 16, tripped on the curb and vanished beneath the others. The woman turned back to help, and that hesitation was all it took. A half-dozen infected emerged from a gap between 2 postal trucks and dragged her down. The teen disappeared under a tangle of limbs. I opened fire without thinking. Hurd followed suit. We dropped 3 before the others reached the edge of the steps, covered in blood and too stunned to speak. One of the men kept asking where the soldiers were. I didn't have the heart to tell him they were gone. Probably halfway across the river by now. Maybe dead too. No one was coming back into the city. The fences were up. The locks were shut. Ottawa was a tomb with the lights still on. Levine took the survivors aside and tried to calm them. I watched the perimeter. More infected were arriving. Their numbers were growing, moving in loose clusters like birds slowly circling something warm. They didn't talk, didn't howl. That made it worse somehow. No drama, just inevitability. They marched forward with mouths open and arms outstretched, like they'd never stopped since the moment they turned. That night, we used riot barriers to form a makeshift perimeter on the steps. We posted a rotation, 2 awake at all times, 1 resting, 1 caring for the wounded. We had 1 functioning radio, short range only. I tried to reach other units. Nothing. The sky was dark by 10, and the infected kept moving even in the shadows. They didn't sleep. The survivors we'd pulled in huddled under their coats, whispering names and prayers. One girl kept clutching a photo of someone, maybe her father, and refused to eat. Her lips were cracked, and her knuckles scraped. The woman who'd been bitten didn't make it past midnight. She didn't scream when it started, just curled inward, like her skin was trying to fold back into itself. We moved her away from the others and watched as her breathing slowed. She stopped. For maybe 3 minutes, everything was still. Then her eyes opened, pale and wrong, and she rose without a sound. Levine shot her before she could take a full step. The girl with the photo didn't speak again after that. We survived that night, but just barely. We were no longer police. Not in any real sense. We were outlaws on our own land, fighting a war with no leadership and no supply chain. I wore the uniform because it was the only armor I had left. My horse still followed my commands, and my pistol still worked, but those were the last certainties I trusted. Morning came with smoke drifting from the east and a line of infected marching past the Supreme Court like ants, ignoring us only because we stayed quiet and still. They didn't sniff us out. They responded to noise, movement, disruption. A tactical predator? No. But a patient one? Absolutely. There would be no sprint to the finish, no sudden wave. The city would just rot from the inside, building by building, 1 bite at a time. We waited until the sun cleared the rooftops before we moved. The infected didn't wander far overnight, just lingered at intersections like they'd forgotten where they were going. They drifted more than walked, sometimes halting mid-stride, heads cocked like they were listening for something. One stepped off the curb and collapsed face first into a bicycle rack, lay there twitching until it finally stopped. Another stumbled across Wellington into the stone wall beside the Justice Building, bounced off it, then kept going. It would have been surreal if it wasn't lethal. They looked like people trying to remember how to be human, but they weren't. We left the court just after 8. I rode Orridge down the steps first, keeping low, rifle across my lap. The others followed in a loose, staggered line, Herd on foot leading the 2 survivors still strong enough to walk. Levine walking Dwyer's horse with the injured man slumped across it like a sack of grain. Dwyer was unconscious most of the time now. He mumbled under his breath and shivered even when wrapped in both our jackets. The signs weren't good. Infection was always a possibility, but so was shock, blood loss, or worse. There wasn't a hospital left in the city that wasn't either on fire or locked from the inside. We took Bay Street south, avoiding the highway and major arteries. Cars had been wedged between lampposts and sidewalks, like people had tried to flee and realized too late that traffic wouldn't save them. Abandoned vehicles sat at odd angles with doors still open, lights flickering. Someone had tried to make a roadblock out of 2 garbage trucks and a flipped SUV. It didn't work. Blood sprayed across the windshields told the rest of the story. We passed a cluster of Ottawa police cruisers near the courthouse, all empty. One still idling in neutral. No keys in the ignition. That meant someone had taken them and left on foot. The survivors barely spoke. The man in the brown coat, I think his name was Carl or Carey, kept holding his side like he was nursing a cracked rib. The girl with the photo hadn't said a word since the night before. She followed Horde like a ghost, always 2 steps behind, never making a sound. I didn't push. We weren't counselors anymore. We were alive, and that had to be enough for now. By noon we reached the Lyon LRT station. It was sealed, shuttered with security grates and jammed doors. We tried the secondary entrance near Slater, but it had been burned out. Either a firebomb or an explosion had torn through the vestibule. Inside, the tiles were blackened, wires hung loose from the ceiling, and the faint metallic stench of cooked blood clung to everything. No survivors, just soot, silence, and one charred arm still clutching a melted smartphone. We doubled back towards Sparks. I was trying to reach the Delta Hotel. I knew some of the emergency service crews had used it as a temporary shelter early on. If there were supplies left, or radios, or maps, we'd find them there. Orridge kept his footing through the rubble, sidestepping a fallen street lamp and the remains of a crashed bicycle. I had to guide him carefully around the blood trails. He didn't like stepping near them. I trusted his instincts more than my own by then. We reached the hotel's loading dock entrance and found the door ajar. Not busted, just left open. That meant someone got out in a hurry. The building was tall enough to have been a good vantage point early in the outbreak, but now it was quiet. Too quiet. I sent Ward and Levine in first while I circled the block on horseback. I didn't want to be cornered inside if something was still in there. Orridge was too big to bring in through the lobby, and I wasn't about to leave him outside alone, not with infected roaming nearby. We posted Dwyer with the others inside the loading bay and secured the door behind us. The lobby was intact. Power was out, but the glass was still whole, and the check-in desk hadn't been looted. Someone had drawn a crude map on the wall behind the front desk, using permanent marker and duct tape. I recognized the handwriting. It was Gibson's, Sergeant Gibson, OPS. He'd been part of the downtown command unit during the first riots in Centertown. His name had come across our radio more than once. The map showed safe zones, check-in points, and rally areas. Most of them had red X's scrawled across them. One spot wasn't crossed out, the courthouse roof. We took the service stairwell to the top floor. It smelled of old sweat and ammonia, like someone had used it as a latrine at some point. On the roof we found old windbreaks, a collapsed field cot, and a set of empty MRE wrappers. Someone had been here, maybe even survived for a few days. They'd left behind a scope lens and half a bottle of filtered water. No bodies, no blood, just abandonment. That was almost a comfort. From the rooftop I could see all the way to the river. Smoke curled from the Portage Bridge. The War Museum's roof had caved in, and the bridges out of the city were gridlocked as far as the eye could see. Nothing moved on the Queensway. Parliament Hill was barely visible through the haze, its tower still upright, but the grounds were empty. It looked peaceful from up here. Quiet. Deceiving. Hurd found a half-charged radio pack in one of the rooftop lockers and got it running on backup power. We tried scanning for emergency frequencies. At first, it was just static. Then a voice came through. Weak, distorted, female. It repeated the same message 3 times. Unit 4-2, fall back to Confederation Park sublevel access. Priority evac redirect. Non-responsive above ground. It was dated, probably hours old, but it was the first real contact we'd had in 2 days. The sublevel access mentioned was likely part of the old maintenance tunnel network, utility corridors that ran beneath downtown connecting buildings and service lines. I'd used them during threat drills years ago. Most officers didn't even know they existed anymore. They weren't marked on public maps. If someone was still using them, it meant there was a fallback happening underground. We voted to try for it. There weren't better options. Staying meant slow starvation or exposure. Leaving might mean a chance, maybe even other survivors. We scouted a route down Bank Street, then cut across Slater. The infected were thicker now, some clustering near the open doors of a grocery store, others trailing fire trucks like insects drawn to sound. We rode around them, using alleys when we could, moving as quietly as possible. The air had grown warmer, but the scent of decay traveled with the wind. A bloated body on a park bench cracked open as we passed, releasing a burst of flies so thick we had to cover our faces. At Confederation Park, we dismounted and crept into the tunnel entrance near the fountain. A grate had been pried loose, and muddy boot prints led downward. The space was narrow, dimly lit by failing battery-powered lamps stuck to the walls with duct tape. I recognized military markers, chalk slashes and unit codes. Someone had organized this. Not long ago either. Maybe the Army engineers. Maybe a city crew that never made it back up. We descended in single file. The horses stayed above, tied to a wrought iron fence with our last bag of oats between them. I hated leaving Orridge. He didn't fight it, but I saw him watching me the way he did during fireworks. Tense, alert, waiting for something to go wrong. I promised myself I'd come back. That was the only lie I allowed. Inside the tunnel the air grew colder, damp. The walls dripped with condensation, and the only sounds were our boots and the low hum of generators echoing from somewhere ahead. We passed rooms filled with empty food crates, broken monitors, a stack of body bags, unused mercifully, then a barricade, makeshift, plastic tables flipped and lashed together with extension cords. Herd called out. No answer. We cleared it and found a hallway lit by string lights running on battery packs. They led to a steel door with a keypad lock. The screen blinked green. Someone had left it open. I stepped through, sidearm raised. Inside was a shelter, crude but real. Tarps, beds, canned food, maps, a water purifier rigged to an old janitorial sink. But no people, no guards. Just their remnants, cold coffee, half-finished notes, a taped list of names with 5 already crossed out. At the far end of the room, I found a blood trail leading under a collapsed shelving unit. Herd lifted it. The body underneath was wearing an EMT patch and had been bitten in 3 places. Judging by the drag marks, he tried to lock himself in before turning. He didn't make it. I radioed out. One last time, voice flat and clear. RCMP unit, Supreme Court evac team, Confederation Park tunnels breached. No active survivors, requesting new orders. No response came, not that I expected one. We spent the next hour checking the rest of the shelter room. Every corner, every crate, every pipe overhead. I wasn't expecting ambushes, but I'd learned not to trust silence in this city. The infected might not have made it this deep, but people had. And people under pressure do unpredictable things. The supplies were real, mostly canned food, some heat-reflective blankets, 2 expired medkits, a few packs of AA batteries. No firearms, no backup radio. Whoever had held this place together did it on improvisation and paper clips, and they hadn't lasted. The walls were tagged with writing, chalk notes, times, dates, initials. One section near the door was covered in crude sketches, maybe made by one of the kids who'd passed through. I saw a drawing of a Mountie on horseback beside what looked like Parliament Hill, then what might have been zombies, just grey stick figures with X's for eyes. Below that, a red X and the word run scratched 3 times. One corner had tally marks, 52 of them. I sat on an overturned crate and removed my helmet for the first time in what felt like days. My hair was stuck to my scalp with dried sweat, and I could smell myself even through the fabric of my uniform. Herd handed me a half-empty water bottle from the stash and said nothing. We weren't in shock. We were past that. What sat in our bones now was the weight of finality. This was it. There would be no airlift, no resupply, no orders from up top. No news crew was going to show up to interview the last patrol. We were just another group of survivors in a city that didn't care anymore. I checked on Dwyer next. His fever had worsened. His breathing had grown shallow and fast, his skin pale and waxy. We kept his leg elevated, but the swelling had reached his thigh. I pulled back the bandage and saw red streaks running up toward his hip. Infection. Not the virus, the old-fashioned kind, but either would kill him just the same. We had no antibiotics. Nothing left to even clean the wound except rubbing alcohol and gauze. I pressed the pad down over the worst of it and felt him flinch, barely conscious. Herd tried the radio again. Nothing but static. We used the last of the portable battery power to keep the lights on, but they dimmed by the hour. The girl who hadn't spoken, the one with the photograph, had curled up against a wall under a blanket and just stared at the floor. She wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink. I tried once, softly, to ask her name. She didn't respond. I couldn't blame her. Names didn't hold much weight anymore. They just reminded us who we'd already lost. We slept in shifts, not that sleep meant much. The tunnels creaked with old pipes, and distant crashes echoed from unknown places like ghosts slamming doors. Once or twice, I thought I heard footsteps, but they never came closer. We weren't sure if anyone else was alive down here. We just knew no one was answering. I dreamed of the stables back at the RCMP compound in Greenbelt, of walking past empty stalls and knowing none of the horses would ever return. When I woke, my pulse was racing and my holster strap was undone. I'd drawn in my sleep. The next morning, I made the decision to leave. The shelter couldn't sustain us. The food would run out, the air would turn stale, and sooner or later someone else would come down looking for the same scraps we found. And maybe they wouldn't knock first. We marked a few key items, packed what we could carry, and rigged a noise trap across the entrance, a string of cans and metal utensils tied to a cord. If someone entered after us, we'd at least have warning. Orridge was still alive when I climbed back into the daylight. So were the others. Dwyer's horse had bucked at something in the distance but hadn't run. I untied Orridge and let him nuzzle my hand. He was thinner, his flanks a little sunken, but he still recognized me, still trusted me enough to follow when I tugged the reins. I don't think I deserved that kind of loyalty anymore, but I accepted it all the same. We regrouped at the north edge of Confederation Park. Levine had a fresh rip in his sleeve and a missing glove. He didn't talk about it. I didn't ask. Hurd was already checking the street with binoculars he'd lifted from the hotel rooftop. The infected were thinning in the downtown core. Either they'd moved on or started clustering somewhere else. That gave us an opening. We needed to get out of the government zone. Too many bottlenecks, too many dead ends. I knew the city's grid well enough. If we could make it to Gladstone or even Bronson, we might find a path out. Not by road, but through the neighborhoods. The kind of old Ottawa where people still kept propane tanks and basements and sheds. We moved south, sticking close to building lines. The horses were quieter now, sensing how empty everything had become. Orridge kept his ears back and his steps precise, like he was avoiding stepping on the wrong memory. We passed burned-out shops on Elgin, a few looted coffeehouses, and the shattered facade of a florist's where petals still clung to the inside of the glass in brown smears. A police cruiser sat abandoned in front of a sandwich shop, its lights still flashing. No one inside. At one intersection, we found a barricade made of dining tables and nailed-together pallets. Behind it were two bodies, older civilians, likely residents who tried to keep the infected out with makeshift cover. One had a crowbar still clenched in one hand, the other a kitchen knife. They weren't soldiers, and they didn't stand a chance. We checked their shelter for supplies, found a pack of AA batteries, one hunting knife, and a canteen with clean water. We took them, not out of disrespect, but necessity. The deeper we moved into Centertown, the quieter it became. Not peace, just the kind of vacuum that settles after violence. The smell of burned paper lingered in the alleys. At a small park near Gilmore Street, we saw the remains of a camp, a ring of tents torn open, supplies scattered, signs of a scuffle. Blood, but no bodies, not even footprints leading away. I wanted to believe they'd made it out, but I knew better. We reached a 3-story brick townhouse that still had a front door intact. Curtains drawn, the windows weren't smashed, and a solar lantern blinked faintly in the hallway beyond the glass. I knocked once, low and sharp. No answer. Knocked again. Still nothing. Hurd checked the alley. No movement. We forced the lock and moved inside with weapons drawn. I announced police presence, though I doubted it mattered anymore. The house was empty, lived in, but empty. Upstairs, we found a room that had been turned into a first aid station. Blankets, a crude splint, even a bottle of antibiotics. The good kind. Doxycycline, not expired. I didn't wait. I gave Dwyer the first dose right there. He moaned once in his sleep and went quiet again. We stayed in that house for the rest of the day, ate quietly, shared a liter of clean water. The girl with the photo finally took a sip, and Hurd sat with her for nearly half an hour, just saying nothing, letting her breathe. I took first watch on the roof that night, laid flat on the shingles, rifle across my arms, watching the city. I saw distant fires near the canal, and what looked like a flare in the east. The infected weren't everywhere, but they were enough. Moving with patient malice, like vines choking a house one brick at a time. I watched them pass a parked school bus, one by one, brushing against the side like shadows. They moved with the weight of inevitability. That's what haunted me. Not the teeth or the blood or the way they tore through skin like it meant nothing, but the certainty of their presence. The way they just kept coming. Not running, not searching, just existing, step after dragging step, until something alive crossed their path. The school bus they passed that night had its hazard lights blinking, still alive on some buried trickle of charge. That soft orange glow painted their faces one by one as they passed. Some brushed it, one paused and leaned its head against the side, like it was listening. Then it moved on, The rest followed without sound. By the time my watch ended, I'd counted at least 35 infected on the move. Not clustered, not converging, just flowing like a tide around broken cars, lampposts, and whatever we used to call civilization. I climbed down from the roof slow, careful not to make noise. Hurd was sleeping on the floor beside the stairs, boots still on. I stepped over him and moved through the kitchen where Levine had built a barricade out of a kitchen table and an old dresser. The girl, finally asleep, was curled on a mattress we dragged in from upstairs. Dwyer hadn't moved. He still breathed, but it was shallow now. The fever hadn't broken. I sat beside him and checked the bandages. The leg was worse. Angry red streaks up past the hip, and the skin around the wound had begun to turn blotchy. I gave him another dose of the antibiotics, knowing it wouldn't be enough. We'd need IVs, surgery, a sterile room, and trained hands. All we had was gauze, alcohol wipes, and a few words of encouragement we didn't believe anymore. I soaked another cloth in bottled water and wiped his face. His eyes fluttered once, but he didn't wake. In the morning, I stepped outside with Orridge. The front lawn was still, save for a single crow perched on the gate. It watched me with the same blank stare the infected had. Behind me, the city murmured with distant echoes. Somewhere, something burned. Somewhere else, metal scraped metal. I led Orridge to the edge of the street and looked down both directions. There were no cars moving, no bikes, no voices. I could hear my own steps on the pavement. For the first time in my career, I realized the silence of a city wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum, and something was always ready to fill it. We ate what we could: canned beans, crackers, the last of the peanut butter from the townhouse kitchen. Hurd found a working wind-up flashlight and a partly charged satellite radio. It only picked up static and one broken weather alert in French. No human voices. We packed what was left and decided to move west. Not to escape, there was no out, but to find others. Maybe a pocket of officers. Maybe a fire crew that hadn't been wiped out. Maybe just another voice telling us we weren't the last ones left. We took Bronson Avenue slowly. Horses first, then survivors. Weapons always drawn. The infected were fewer here. We passed wrecked ambulances and crushed barriers near the highway off-ramp. One sedan had driven straight into the back of a public works truck and caught fire. Its blackened skeleton still sat there, metal warped, and windows cracked outward from the heat. I tried not to picture who'd been inside. Orridge snorted at the smell, but kept walking. At Somerset, we found something new. Graffiti. Not tags, not vandalism. Messages. Someone had painted arrows and words across the sides of buildings and traffic signs. Safe, one said. Another, Food West. We followed them with caution. I'd seen traps before. Good people lured in by hope and gutted for their gear. But these seemed too rushed, too frantic. The paint dripped like it had been sprayed in a hurry, and some signs were barely legible. They led us through a side street off Bayswater and into a block of duplexes with boarded windows and reinforced doors. One house had smoke rising from a metal chimney extension, a converted wood stove. Levine knocked with a long metal pipe, twice, then once. We waited. A slot opened in the door. Eyes, brown and tired, stared out at us from behind wire mesh. "Uniformed?" the voice asked. I nodded and showed my badge. The door opened. Inside was a man in his 50s, armed with a long-barreled shotgun. He wore a heavy mechanic's jacket and smelled like sweat, ash, and oil. Name was Bernard, or Bernie. He didn't care what we called him. He'd holed up with his daughter, son-in-law, and 3 other neighbors. Said he used to work city maintenance, retired early, still had access to his old emergency stash. He let us in on one condition. We helped him reinforce the perimeter and didn't bring the infected down on the block. I agreed. We stabled the horses in what had once been a carport, cleared out the trash and debris. Bernie had hay from a nearby school garden coop and water from a rain catch on the roof. Orridge drank like he hadn't in days. I removed his tack and brushed his coat as best I could with a broom head. He leaned into it and closed his eyes. I couldn't tell if it was comfort or exhaustion. Dwyer was brought inside and placed on a cot in what used to be a home office. Bernie's daughter had nursing experience. Not formal, but enough. She checked his leg and made a sound I didn't like. She cleaned it, gave him a fresh dose of what little antibiotics they had, and told me bluntly, he's not going to walk again, if he survives. I thanked her, not for the prognosis, but the honesty. That night, we ate with others for the first time in days. There was stew, real stew, made from garden squash, rice, and dried meat. The girl with the photograph sat next to Bernie's grandson, maybe 6 years old. They didn't speak, but they passed crayons back and forth. Hurd actually smiled. Levine didn't eat much but stood watch outside the window, back straight like he was still on duty. I sat at the far end of the table and listened. The stories were all the same. Ambulances that never came, neighbors that turned, barricades that fell, radios that went silent. I fell asleep on the floor near the pantry, my rifle laid across my legs, my badge beside me. I dreamed of snow, of standing post outside the Parliament gates in winter, while Orridge huffed steam from his nostrils and children tossed snowballs at each other near the flame. It was quiet, calm. When I woke, Bernie's daughter was already boiling water for the morning wash. The next few days passed with routine, patrols, reinforcement, repairs. We built trip alarms along the street and reinforced doors with leftover lumber. At night, we took shifts on the roof, scanning for movement. Sometimes, infected wandered near. We didn't fire, we waited them out. Fire meant noise, and noise meant death. That became a rule. Dwyer didn't wake up again. He passed on the 5th night. Quiet, no gasping, no final words. His chest just stopped. We watched him for 6 hours to make sure he didn't rise. Then we took him outside and buried him in the backyard under a crabapple tree. I said his full name. Levine put his badge on the trunk. We didn't cry. There wasn't room for it. We stayed another day, but I knew it couldn't last. Bernie's supplies wouldn't stretch for all of us. The neighborhood was a pocket, a fragile one. If the wrong noise echoed, if the wrong trail led an infected pack through the fence, it would all be over. We packed again, not to abandon, just to move forward, to keep doing what we were trained to do, serve, protect, ride out into the unknown. As I saddled Orridge one last time, I felt the weight of everything behind me. Parliament locked from the inside, dispatch gone, Dwyer dead, survivors scattered across a city bleeding into its own cracks. But I still wore the uniform, I still had my weapon, my mount. My orders may have vanished, but duty hadn't. We moved west through the back roads of the Civic Hospital neighborhood, avoiding any open intersections or multi-lane stretches where the infected might have congregated. Levine took point, rifle shouldered, but never raised unless it needed to be. Hurd stayed rear with the girl and the supplies, riding lead on one of the horses we'd rescued days earlier. I kept us in the middle, Orridge steady beneath me. Each step echoed off the low-rise homes and narrow alleys, a reminder of how empty the world had become. The wind carried birdsong, distant sirens, and the ever-present possibility of a scream. But that day, at least in the early hours, there was none. The neighborhoods were warped reflections of what they had once been. Playground swings rusted in place, their chains clinking softly with each breeze. Lawn furniture sat tipped in backyards gone wild. A sprinkler head still ran in one yard, spinning lazily, feeding nothing but tall weeds and cracked pavement. At one intersection, an inflatable pool half full of green rainwater hosted a drowned raccoon and 2 swarms of flies. These weren't scenes of a battlefield. They were relics of absence, signs that the end hadn't come with fire and brimstone, but with confusion and silence. We stopped briefly at a small church near Carling and Island Park, its doors wide open and front steps littered with prayer books and candle wax. Inside, the air was stale and heavy. Someone had dragged pews into a defensive wall around the altar, and the floor bore the signs of a long stay, pillows, wrappers, scattered clothes. But no people, just a child's shoe by the pulpit, toppled over as if kicked off in a rush. Hurd found an old radio under the sacristy table, powered by a cracked solar charger. It worked barely. A voice emerged from it in short bursts, military cadence, then a woman's voice reading off coordinates. Faint, but real. The transmission repeated. Then silence. Then again. The coordinates pointed southwest, somewhere near the outskirts of the city, past Bell's Corners. That was a long way on foot, but we had horses and a direction. We left the church and followed the sound of the voice. For the first time since Ottawa fell, we had something resembling a destination. That knowledge changed our pace. It gave shape to our hours. We no longer wandered. We moved with intention. The girl, whose name we still didn't know, rode behind Horde in silence. She held the radio like it was her lifeline, listening to that cracked signal repeat as if willing it to grow stronger. 2 hours later, while cutting through a wooded bike path off Merivale, we spotted smoke. Not the kind from burning debris, but the clean, controlled kind. Someone cooking. We dismounted and approached on foot. Levine flanked right. I moved up the path with Orridge trailing quietly behind. The source was a clearing between a gas station and a garden center. 10 tents arranged in a wide circle, camouflaged with tarps painted in dirt and ash to break up the color. At the center, a tripod pot sat over coals. A man stirred with a wooden ladle. He didn't look up. I made myself visible and called out, not with authority but with caution. RCMP, not here to hurt anyone. That meant nothing anymore, but it was all I had. The man raised his head and squinted, then nodded. We figured someone would come sooner or later, he said. His name was Thomasin, or so he claimed. He'd been an Ottawa firefighter before the collapse, stationed downtown. When the station was overrun, he took a crew of 8 and fled. Only 3 remained now, including a nurse and a former paramedic. They'd been monitoring the same signal we had. It repeated on the hour, every hour, no variation. Just a voice, a time, and a promise. Safe zone, limited access, check-in by fire or light. I told them we were heading there. He nodded again. Said we were the first mounted unit they'd seen since the second day. His camp had watched Parliament seal its own gates from a rooftop vantage point, days earlier. We figured anyone outside those walls was already written off, he said, voice without malice. Just facts. We stayed the night in that camp, watched by strangers, fed warm broth, shared no names. Thomasin kept his distance after dark, but his nurse, Sarah, sat with Levine and Horde and offered basic wound care, some antiseptic, and advice. She checked the girl over. No injuries, no sign of fever or bite, just malnourishment and dissociation. We thanked her. The girl didn't look up. Before sunrise, we moved again. The route west meant cutting through Nepean, through old commercial zones turned into wastelands, strip malls burned to concrete shells, drive-thrus stripped clean of their windows, rows of shops where mannequins lay shattered on broken tiles, like bodies frozen in mid-step. One billboard still displayed a half-ripped ad for a movie release that never came. The infected were fewer, but smarter in their patterns. Not in mind, just in numbers. They wandered more slowly here, farther apart, but they showed signs of trail behavior. They followed blood, followed tracks. One even followed a rabbit into a bush and stood there waiting as if something in its brain still knew how to anticipate prey. We passed them by like shadows, using the horses for height and speed. We were lucky. 3 encounters. No bites, no close calls, but every block was a gamble. We reached the coordinates near dusk, an old telecom relay station perched on a hill behind an industrial park. Fenced, generator-powered, no visible movement. The front gate was chained shut, but a white flag flew from the upper antenna tower, a signal, not surrender. I climbed the gate while Huard covered. Levine stayed with the girl. Inside, it was real. Military-grade cots, medical gear, maps with coordinated markings. And people, about 12 of them, maybe more. No uniforms, just survivors. But organized, calm. One man approached with a clipboard, not a weapon, asked for names. I gave mine. Staff Sergeant Chloe Dumais, RCMP, unit disbanded. The man nodded and made a note. "You're late," he said. I asked what that meant. He explained that evac had already passed twice. A convoy from Kingston had tried to make the approach 2 days ago, but pulled back after heavy losses on the east perimeter. The signal was a test now, a marker. Anyone who arrived, and could hold the compound was allowed to stay. No questions, no rank, just survival. We accepted. We were assigned sleeping quarters inside an old broadcast room with cracked monitors and foam paneling falling from the walls. It was dry, quiet, and safe. That night, I slept without my boots on for the first time in a week. Orage was stabled in a cargo garage with 3 other surviving animals. 1 goat, 2 dogs, and a mule someone said came all the way from Aranpria. In the days that followed, we became part of the outpost. We ran patrols, repaired perimeter fences, helped log inventory. I trained 3 of the survivors to ride and patrol on horseback, not for ceremony, but for speed and silence. Orage never left my side. We moved like we had before the fall, 2 units in sync, scanning rooftops, alleyways, and ruined streets for motion. Somewhere along the way, the girl started talking. Not much, just words, sometimes names, sometimes places. One afternoon, she sat beside me on the outpost's roof, sketching in the dirt with a stick. I asked what she was drawing. She said, "Parliament." I asked if she remembered it. She nodded and said, "I saw them close the doors. I watched them lock us out." She never told me who was in the photograph. I never asked again. Some things deserve their silence. A month passed, then 2. The infected didn't vanish, but the panic did. We became what the city had failed to build. A community, held together not by command or law, but by effort. Everyone worked. Everyone watched the gate. And we all remembered those who didn't make it. I never took off the uniform, not even after it frayed. I stitched the sleeves. I polished the buttons. I wore it because it reminded me of something that used to matter. Not the institution, but the intent. To serve, to stand guard, to hold the line when no one else would. Years from now, someone will rebuild this place. Someone will fly a flag again and call it a capital. But it won't be because of politics or speeches. It'll be because someone, somewhere, didn't stop. Someone climbed back into the saddle and kept going west. Not to escape, but to carry what was left. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.